Hello, guys, and once again, this is your Doc A again. So, in continuation, we're going to have the care for clients with respiratory disorders, but at this point, okay, so basically, what we are going to have is a discussion in terms of the different diagnostic studies and possible therapies or procedures that our clients with respiratory disorders would have. Okay, first on the list is the MAN2 test. Okay, so our MAN2 test is a PPD or a purified protein derivatives. And usually we are doing this test through intradermal. So it's like skin testing. Okay, and we need to read the results after 48 to 72 hours after injection. Usually during skin testing, we are reading the results after 30 minutes. However, for our PPD, for our MAN2 test, we are reading the results after 48 to 72 hours, meaning to say around 2 days to 3 days before we were able to read the results. Okay, so there will be positive for MAN2 test if the result of our skin test, when we measure it after 2 to 3 days, it is 10 millimeters or more. Positive with Manto test suggests that there is an exposure to Mycobacterium tuberculosis bacilli, meaning to say the one who is responsible in having tuberculosis, so like pulmonary tuberculosis. Okay. However, Manto test or the PPD could also be used to test for patients with HIV. Usually, the induration is around 5 millimeters. So we might consider that the patient is positive for HIV. However, positive on MAN2 test. So again, the result is 10 millimeter or more. If there is a big possibility that we will be positive for the MAN2 test. Okay. Positive for this would be secondary for the vaccine that we were able to receive before, like the BCG. So because that is an attenuated vaccine, so the microorganism is really there. So it will possibly make our test positive for the MAN2 test. Okay. So if we really wanted to do a screening for tuberculosis, what we could do is the QFT. Okay, QFT. QFT stands for quantiferon tuberculosis. So that is a better option for us to do the TB screening. Okay, so next one on our list is the chest x-ray. Okay, so when we talk about chest x-ray, so basically um, we could be able to see the imagery of the chest in this particular test. Okay, so for nursing responsibilities, the patient needs to practice on how to hold their breath and do the breathing exercises. Okay, so during the procedure, we need to instruct the patient to remove all metals from their chest and even from their waist because metals are radio opaque and it might be mistaken for lesions. So another test aside from X-ray that we have is the fluoroscopy. So fluoroscopy is the study of the lungs and chest in motion. So meaning to say, we could see the movement of the lungs and the chest through fluoroscopy. So next, we also have the bronchography. So our bronchography, also known as bronchogram, So it is a radiopaque medium that is instilled directly into the trachea and the bronchi, and the entire bronchial tree or selected areas may be visualized. So since it is a radiopaque, so one of the nursing responsibilities that we have here is to assess the client for any allergies. We need to check, we need to ask them if they have allergies for seafoods, okay, because of the iodine content that it might have, okay? So some nursing interventions, some nursing responsibilities that we could do for patients who will be undergoing bronchography or bronchogram. First, we need to secure consent, okay, because we need to inject something on the patient. Okay, so we need to secure consent. Second, check for any allergies, just like what I have told you a while ago. We need to check if they have allergies with seafoods because of the iodine content. Okay, because the radiopaque medium is made up of iodine. If they have um, allergies with anesthesia, we also need to ask that, or any other medications. So another nursing responsibility that we need to do is to instruct the patient to remain on NPO or nothing per RM for around 6 to 8 hours, because we wanted to prevent aspiration during and after the procedure. So there could be some preoperative meds or pre-procedures medications that could be given, such as atropine sulfate. We know that atropine sulfate will limit or decrease the secretions of body fluid. So basically, we are going to give atropine sulfate to keep the airway clear from any saliva and mucus secretions. Okay, so another possible procedure medication that could be given is Valium or diazepam or benzodiazepine. So this one is given for us to reduce the patient's anxiety, to make them more relaxed during the procedure. Okay. Another thing, we could also give a topical anesthesia. Okay, like it could be sprayed on the mouth, on the oral membrane. Okay. Then we could be able to follow a local anesthesia that is injected into the larynx. So why we are doing this? Why do we need to give the sprayed or the topical anesthesia first? Because we wanted to limit or decrease the gag reflex. Okay, so that when we are going to inject the local anesthesia of the larynx, it will be easier for us. So why do we need to give a local anesthesia in the larynx? So basically, it is done so that we could be able to depress, again, the gag reflex, and it will also facilitate the insertion of the bronchoscope that will be used in visualizing the area. And of course, maybe we could also give the patient oxygen and antispasmodic agent. Or if not, we are not yet giving them, at least we are prepared and ready at the bedside for possible use of oxygen and antispasmodic agent. So in terms of our nursing interventions for patients after bronchography, so we need to position the patient on side-lying position. We're doing this because we wanted to prevent aspiration, especially that we were able to depress the gag reflex. So there is a very big possibility that the patient might have aspiration. Another thing, after the procedure, we need to remain the patient on NPO or nothing per RM until the patient gained the cough and gag reflex. Meaning to say, once the gag reflex and the coughing is already returned to the patient, we could start giving them um, soft soft diet, and so on. Okay? So what else? We could also teach the patient coughing and deep breathing exercises. Okay? And lastly, we also need to monitor the patient's vital signs, especially temperature, because low-grade fever is a common complication after the procedure. Next one, we have the bronchoscopy. So basically, when we talk about bronchoscopy, so it is the direct inspection and observation of our larynx, trachea, and bronchi using a flexible and rigid bronchoscope. Okay, so we are using an equipment, which is the bronchoscope. So basically, bronchoscopy is done for diagnostic purposes, meaning to say if we wanted to see, if we wanted to observe the larynx, the trachea, and the bronchi, we could use bronchoscopy. Okay, second, it could be used for us to be able to collect secretions that are needed. And lastly, we could also use bronchoscopy for us to determine the location of pathologic process and for the collection of specimen that could be used for biopsy. Okay? So again, bronchoscopy could be used as diagnostic procedure. It could be used in collecting secretions. Okay? And it could also be used as a therapeutic for therapeutic purposes. Okay? For example, removal of aspirated foreign objects. So bronchoscopy could be done. Excise of small lesion, bronchoscopy could be done as long as those foreign objects and lesions could be seen on the larynx, trachea, and even on the bronchi. Okay? So nursing responsibilities, nursing interventions before the procedure. So again, we need to secure consent. We could give pre-procedural medications like atropine sulfate, like Valium or diazepam or benzodiazepines. We could give topical anesthesia followed by local anesthesia. So I already explained those things. Why do we need to do those things or to give those things to our patients? Next, do not forget to instruct them to be on NPO 6 to 8 hours. We need to remove dentures, prostheses, contact lenses, if ever. Okay, just basically we're doing this to prevent airway obstruction and for us to avoid losses of any valuables from our patient. Okay, so next up, we also need to know what are the things that we need to do after bronchoscopy. So again, what will be the position just like a while ago? Yes, the position is side lying position. Basically, we wanted to promote drainage of secretion from the mouth. That's why we wanted to position the patient on a side lying position. Next, we need to check for the return of cough and gag reflex before giving any food, okay, for us to prevent aspiration. um, we also need to watch and monitor the patient for any signs of cyanosis, hy- hypotension, okay, hypotension, tachycardia, arrhythmias, hemoptysis, and dyspnea. Because these signs and symptoms might indicate perforation of the bronchial tree. So again, do not forget to monitor the patient for any of these signs and symptoms: cyanosis, hypotension, tachycardia, arrhythmias, hemoptysis, and dyspnea, because those things could be a sign of bronchial tree perforation. Okay, next, we have the lung scan. So for the lung scan, so basically following a lung scan, we are injecting a radioisotope and scan are taken with scintillation camera. So when we talk about scintillation, we're dealing about gamma rays. Okay? Okay, so our lung scan will be able to help us measure the blood perfusion through the lungs. Do you still remember the definition of perfusion? Yeah, if we wanted to measure the amount of oxygen level on the blood, so basically that is perfusion, the amount of oxygen in the blood. So basically in the blood in our lungs for the lung scan. So usually the lung scan is used to confirm whether the patient is suffering from pulmonary embolism, or it could also suggest other blood flow abnormalities. So, if ever we have a patient who will undergo lung scan, what we need to tell them is to remain still during the procedure, meaning to say they need to make sure that they are still or they are not moving during the procedure because it might affect on the results. Okay? So next, we have the sputum examination. So for our sputum examination, there are quite a lot of things that we need to remember. First, we need to check for the gross appearance. Okay, we need to check and look and observe for how does the sputum looks like. Okay, so to assess for gross appearance of the sputum, so there could be some changes on the sputum specific specification. I mean, for example, if we have different colors that we were able to see on the sputum, it might suggest different microorganism or different diseases. For instance, if we were able to look at and observe that the sputum is rusty, so it would suggest that it is a pneumococcal pneumonia. Okay? If the sputum is greenish, it suggests Pseudomonas infection. If there is blood tinge on the sputum, it suggests pulmonary tuberculosis. So that is how big is the role of the gross appearance in the sputum examination. Okay, so again, if there is rusty sputum, it suggests pneumococcal pneumonia. If there is greenish sputum, it suggests Pseudomonas infection. And if there are blood tinge in the sputum, it suggests pulmonary tuberculosis. Okay. So sometimes this is sputum undergo culture and sensitivity examination. Okay. So basically, sputum culture and sensitivity is done to detect the actual microorganisms causing the respiratory infection. If we wanted to know what type of microorganism is causing the respiratory problem, the respiratory infection, what we can do is the sputum culture and sensitivity. Okay, so that's one of the possible tests that they might undergo under sputum examination. Another one is the AFB or the acid fast bacillus staining. So basically, the AFB staining or acid fast bacillus staining is used to detect pulmonary tuberculosis. We could also have cytologic examination. Okay, we're going to look at the sputum per se, and it will assess for the presence of any cancer cells. So, how do we collect the sputum? What are the instructions that we need to give to our client if they will be undergoing sputum examination? So, first, we need to tell them that the sputum needs to be collected early morning. Okay? So sputum usually accumulate in the lungs during the sleep and it can easily be coughed out in the morning. So usually do not tell them to gargle their mouth, to rinse their mouth with mouthwash or any chemical based products, okay, before doing this. Okay, what we can advise them is to rinse their mouth with plain water only, okay, before collecting or before the collection of the sputum specimen. Okay, so again, tell them that they could rinse their mouth using plain water, but do not use mouthwash, okay? Because the mouthwash has alcohol content, and this alcohol content might destroy the microorganism present in the sputum. Next, we need to use a sterile container to ensure that the specimen is not contaminated. Okay, so usually, if the patient is for sputum examination, the laboratory is giving them a sterile container where they could be able to put the specimen. If ever the patient is for AFB staining, so we need to collect the specimen for 3 consecutive mornings, okay, with the same instructions. And if the patient is for cytologic examination, so we could also um, tell them, okay, almost the same thing. We need to put the specimen on a sterile container. It should be collected on the morning, early morning. Okay, they could rinse their mouth with plain water, but not with mouthwash. So sputum specimen for culture and sensitivity is collected before the first dose of antimicrobial. So meaning to say, if the patient is for culture and sensitivity test, make sure that they are not using any antibiotics yet. Okay? So because the test needs to be done prior the first dose of antimicrobial. So for AFB staining, we need to collect the specimen sputum for 3 consecutive mornings. Do not forget that. Next, lung biopsy. Okay, so biopsy. So the common thing that we can do for biopsy, it could be lung biopsy or lymph node biopsy. So for lung biopsy, we could have transbronchoscopic biopsy. So usually it is done during the bronchoscopy. Then during the bronchoscopy, while you are or the doctor is visualizing, they might get a specimen. Okay, that's one of the possible way for us to do lung biopsy. Another one, we could have the percutaneous needle biopsy. Percutaneous needle biopsy. So it is done with the use of aspiration needle. So there will be a syringe. Okay, it will be injected on the lung part. Then we will aspirate, or the doctor will aspirate. Okay, so the tissue that was aspirated will be tested for biopsy, for lung biopsy. And lastly, for lung biopsy, we could also have an open lung biopsy. So meaning to say, it will be under an operation wherein there will be an opening on the thorax to get a sample of the tissue. Okay? Or sometimes the patient is undergoing pneumonectomy, so that part that was being removed, so they will be getting a specimen there. So it's also an option to do. Okay. So aside from lung biopsy, we can also have the lymph node biopsy. Okay, so for lymph node biopsy, usually it is ischial or at the cervical mediastinal area. So ischial, remember the muscle, so there is a lymph node there, or the cervical mediastinal area. So that is the common site to get the specimen. Okay, so basically, having the lymph node biopsy is done for us to assess if there is already a metastasis of the lung cancer. Okay, So a while ago when we are discussing the anatomy and physiology of the respiratory system. So you were able to manage to hear some of these terminologies that are written here. Okay, they are all part of the pulmonary function studies. Okay, so when we talk about vital capacity or the VC is the maximum volume of air that can be exhaled after a minimum inhalation. So usually the vital capacity is reduced if the patient has COPD. Okay, COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So later, during the discussions of diseases, we are going to discuss COPD. So next we have the TV or the tidal volume. So the tidal volume is the volume of air that is inhaled and exhaled with normal quiet breathing. Okay. So next we have the inspiratory reserve volume. So the inspiratory reserve volume is the maximum volume that can be inhaled following a normal quiet exhalation. Okay. On the other hand, we have the expiratory reserve volume. So this is the maximum volume that can be exhaled following a normal quiet inhalation. We also have the term here, which is the functional residual capacity. When we talk about functional residual capacity, this is the volume of air that remains in the lungs after quiet exhalation. And lastly, we have residual volume. So residual volume are the volume of air that remains in the lungs after forceful exhalation. So just like what I have told you, these things have been discussed already during the discussions of the anatomy and physiology of the respiratory system. However, these are also the parts that are being tested when we talk about pulmonary functions. Okay? So we have vital capacity, tidal volume, inspiratory reserve volume, expiratory reserve volume, functional residual capacity, and residual volume. So next one, we have the ABG. ABG or the arterial blood gas. So it is used to assess the ventilation and the acid-base balance. So I know you are already familiar with ABG since this is the test for us to check the ventilation and the acid-base balance that you were able to discuss during the discussions of fluids and electrolytes. Okay? So in doing the ABG, um, the most common site for the withdrawal of blood specimen is at the radial artery. Okay. Aside from that, Allen's test, ALLEN apostrophe S, Allen's test is done for us to assess the adequacy of collateral circulation of the hand. It is the test for the ulnar artery. So basically in doing the ABG, we need to assess the Allen's test first. Okay, we need to do that so that we could know whether the ulnar nerve could be able to give the adequate circulation that is needed by our hands. Okay, so in performing the Allen's test, of course, how can we do the procedure if we really don't know how to do the procedure, right? So how do we perform Allen's test? First, we need to inform the patient and explain the purpose of the procedure. Okay? So after that, we need to apply pressure on the radial and the ulnar arteries. So meaning to say putting pressure on the radial and ulnar arteries will make sure that there are no blood supply going to our hand. So while we are putting pressure on the radial and the ulnar arteries, we're going to ask the patient to close and open his hand until the hands becomes blanch, meaning to say that it's pale, it's so pale already. Okay? And when that happens, we are going to release the ulnar artery. Okay, so how are we going to know? So radial artery, ulnar artery here. Okay, so if we put pressure on both, then we ask them to do the close and open, so there will be no blood supply on the hands. Okay, then once it is white already, when it is pale already, we can release the ulnar artery. Okay, so after that, we need to assess if the hand returns to pinkish color. Okay? We need to check how long before the hand becomes pink again. Okay, it is said that the normal result is within 6 seconds. Okay, that is the normal results. So if that is more than 6 seconds, it means that the ulnar artery is quite slow. Okay, meaning to say that there could be some inadequacy possibly. Okay, so after that, we need to document. Okay, if return to pinkish color and the hand is longer than 6 seconds, it means that there is poor collateral circulation of the hand. So therefore, the radial artery should not be used for blood draw for our ABG monitoring. Okay? So are we clear with ABG and even with the use of um, Allen's test? Okay. So if ever we're going to do the ABG already, we already know that the ulnar artery could provide the necessary, the appropriate blood supply to the hand. So it's time for us to withdraw blood at the radial artery. So we are going to use a 10 ml pre-heparinized syringe so that it will prevent clotting of the specimen. Okay, so after that, we need to place the specimen in a container with ice. Why do we need to do that? So that we could prevent hemolysis or hemolysis of the specimen. So if hemolysis occurs, the oxygen and the carbon dioxide are released and cannot be measured accurately. That is why we need to put it on ice. Okay, a container with ice. Okay, and the results needs to be recorded as saturated oxygen. Okay, SaO2. So that's what we usually write, SaO2, meaning to say that it stands for the oxygen saturation. Okay, so for our next procedure, we have the thoracentesis. Okay, so thoracentesis is the aspiration of fluid or air from the pleural space. Remember, in between our visceral and parietal pleura, there is the pleural cavity or the pleural space. So that space could have fluid on it, or it could have air on it. Okay, so and excess of those things could lead to problems. Later, we're going to discuss that when we proceed on the different disorders. Like, for example, if there are accumulation of fluid on that area, we call it as pleural effusion. Okay. However, if there are air on those area, on the pleural space or the pleural cavity, excess air, excess, we call it as pneumothorax. Okay. So before the procedure, before thoracentesis, we need to make sure to get consent because, or to secure consent since it is an invasive procedure. We need to monitor and assess the vital signs of our patient. Okay, since aspiration of air or fluid on the pleural space can cause hypovolemic shock. So how can we be able to observe hypovolemic shock? Okay, yeah. So basically, hypovolemic shock, if the patient is experiencing hypotac. So hypotension, tachycardia, tachypnea. So think of that the patient might experience shock. Okay? That is why we need to monitor the patient's vital sign. So in terms of position, for thoracentesis, the position is upright, leaning on overbed table. Okay, so it's like this. Okay, but the back part should be exposed. Okay. Okay, so and our feet needs to be supported on a footstool for comfort, especially those who cannot reach the floor. Okay, so during the procedure, we need to instruct the patient to stay still, to remain still. We also need to tell them to avoid coughing during the insertion of the needle because those things, moving and coughing, could cause trauma to the lungs. Okay. Next, they could be able to feel some pressure, okay, during the insertion of the needle. So what we could do, the doctor could be able to put topical anesthetic, okay, so that it will numb the area. So after the procedure, for instance, the procedure is already done, the thoracentesis. So we can position the patient on the unaffected side. Okay, so we can position the patient on the unaffected side. So you could put them on a side lying position if you wanted to, as long as it is on the unaffected side, to prevent leakage of fluid on the thoracic cavity. Okay. Next, we also need to instruct them to be at bed rest, okay, until the vital signs is stable so that we could be able to prevent postural hypotension. Next, we also need to check for the expectoration of blood, okay? We need to monitor that. We need to ask them if after the procedure, are they able to expectorate blood? Is there any hemoptysis? Okay? Because any blood or hemoptysis or expectoration of blood indicates trauma to the lungs. Remember, what we only need to inject is at the pleural space. It should not go beyond the pleural space. Okay? So if ever this happens, if ever they have hemoptysis or they were able to expectorate blood, we need to notify the physician, and we also need to monitor and assess the patient's vital signs. We also need to assess any signs and symptoms of internal hemorrhage. Okay, so what could be the signs and symptoms that the patient is experiencing internal hemorrhage? So it is usually manifested by tachycardia, tachypnea, hypotension, and hypothermia. Okay? So if those things are present, and the patient was able to expectorate blood, so think of that the patient is experiencing an internal hemorrhage. There is already a trauma on the lungs. Okay, next is the use of pulse oximetry. So I know that you are already um, expert in terms of the usage of pulse oximeter, right? So our pulse oximetry is used to determine the oxygen saturation in the blood. Okay, so what is the normal value? Okay, yeah, 95 to 100% is the normal value of oxygen saturation. So what we can see on our pulse oximeter is it has a sensor. If you're going to look at inside, there's a red thingy, a red thing that you can notice on the inside that are lighting up if ever it's open, right? And we just need to place the index finger or anything that we could be able to place there. Okay, like the earlobe or the we could also use different types of pulse oximeter. Okay, like there are patches that could be used to get the oxygen saturation. So with that, you could also put that over the nose. Okay. So make sure that the sensor should be covered by an opaque material. Okay. The reading can be affected by sunlight or bright lights. That is why sometimes we are asked to cover the pulse oximeter while we are getting the oxygen saturation when we are using because they are light sensitive. Okay. Make sure that before you are using the pulse oximeter, make sure that there are no nail polish. So if ever there are any, we need to remove the nail polish um, because the nail polish can affect the accuracy of the pulse oximeter reading. Okay, so and lastly, we need to record the results of the oxygen saturation based on the results that we were able to get in our pulse oximeter. Okay, here are some other common respiratory interventions. So oxygen therapy. I know you already know how to connect the patient into the oxygen. So usually the level of oxygen, well, actually it really depends upon the doctor's order, but usually it's 1 to 3 liters per minute. Okay, and make sure that um, the container there has the fluid needed. So always check the line. It should be within the limit. Okay, it should not be over the limit or below the limit. So next we have the tracheobronchial suctioning. So I know that you were able to suction already. Yeah, hopefully. So if ever you're going to suction the patient, ideally, we need to position the patient on a semi-Fowler's position. Okay, make sure that we are using sterile gloves in doing so. Okay, and we are also using sterile suction catheter. So before we start the tracheobronchial suctioning, we need to hyperventilate the client using 100% oxygen before and after suctioning. Okay? So after hyperventilating the client, we could insert the catheter with glove hand. And usually we need to insert around 3 to 5 inches length of the catheter insertion. So after that, make sure to apply suction during the withdrawal of the catheter. So in withdrawing the catheter, use a rotating movement. Okay? So when withdrawing the catheter, always rotate. Okay? Always rotate. The reason for that is to minimize the friction, to minimize the possible injury on the linings. Okay, that is why we need to rotate it. Okay, and at the same time we need to apply intermittent suctioning. Okay, so in suctioning, it should only take around 10 seconds, not more than 10 seconds. Well, actually, some books are stating it could be up to 15 seconds, but that is the maximum. Okay, but ideally, up to 10 seconds only. Okay? After 10 seconds of suctioning, hyperventilate again the patient. So after that, after our suctioning, so we need to evaluate the patient. So how could we be able to evaluate, assess and monitor the breath sounds of the patient through auscultation of the chest. So ideally, after suctioning, they should have a clear breath sounds. Next, we have the bronchial hygiene measures. Okay, for bronchial hygiene measures, um, so part of it is suctioning. Okay, in suctioning, it could be oropharyngeal and nasopharyngeal. Okay. Next, we could do the steaming or aerosol or medimist inhalation. Then after that, we could do the chest physiotherapy. Okay. In terms of the discussion of the chest physiotherapy, it is on the next slide. Okay. We have also the incentive spirometry. For incentive spirometry, usually this is done to enhance the deep inhalation. And lastly, we also have a slide for us to discuss in terms of closed chest drainage or the use of the thoracostomy tube. So basically, these are the different positions in chest physiotherapy. So we are putting the patient on that position depending on where are the problem area. Okay. So if you will notice, there are red dots. So those are the problem area. And if that is the problem area, here are the recommended positions for our patients. So basically, in doing chest physiotherapy, what we are doing is one, postural drainage. That's why we are positioning them. Okay, we need to have postural drainage. Second, after putting the patient in those positions, we could do percussions and vibrations afterwards. Okay. So for nursing responsibility for chest physiotherapy, we need to verify the doctor's order first, okay, before doing the procedure. We also need to assess for the accumulation of mucus secretion. So check whether the secretions are really there at the red points, okay, so that we know that the position that we're going to do to them is correct. Okay. Next, once we were able to assess the location of the mucus secretion, okay, place the patient to allow expectoration of the mucus secretions using gravity. So these are the positions that we could use, okay, and place the client on each position for about 10 to 15 minutes, okay. So after that, percussion and vibration are done. Basically, we are doing that to loosen the mucus secretions. So next step is for us to change the position gradually for us to prevent postural hypotension. So most likely, the whole chest physiotherapy will last around 60 to 90 minutes. Okay. However, it really depends on how many positions are we going to do. So make sure that the patient are not on full stomach in doing the chest physiotherapy. Okay. So usually it is done before mealtime, or it could be done in the morning upon awakening. Okay, make sure that they are not full with food. Okay, and it could also be done at bedtime. So another thing that we need to do if we are doing chest physiotherapy is to provide good oral care after the procedure. And on this slide, we could see the closed chest drainage or the thoracostomy tube. So basically, our closed chest drainage is used to first for us to remove the air or the fluid from the pleural space, whatever is there. May it be air, again, if that is air, pneumothorax, right? If that is fluid, we call it as pleural effusion. So depending on what specific type of fluid is there, so we have certain medical terminologies for that. So that's the first purpose. The second purpose of that is for us to re-establish the negative pressure. Always remember that our lungs is a negative pressure. Okay, and we also need to re-expand the lungs. So those are the purposes of thoracostomy tube or the closed chest drainage. We wanted to remove the air or the fluid on the pleural spaces. We wanted to reestablish negative pressure, and we wanted to re-expand the lungs. So there are several principles that are involved in the mechanism of the closed chest drainage. Okay, one of those principles is the drainage by gravity. So the bottle or the bottles, always remember, should be at least 2 to 3 feet below the level of the chest. So meaning to say, the tube should not be at the same level of our chest or above our chest, okay? Because what we wanted is to use the gravity to drain those air and fluid from our pleural spaces. Another principle that we are using is the displacement principle. So there is an air vent. For example, at all of the bottle systems that we have here, may it be one bottle system, if you will notice, there are two tubes on this bottle. So one of those is the air vent, okay? So the air vent will expel the air from the bottle as drainage occupies the space in the bottle. So make sure that the air vent should always be kept open. Okay, and the third principle that we have for closed chest drainage is the suction or the negative pressure. So the suction or negative pressure will aid the it will aid removing the air or the fluid from the pleural spaces. Okay, so again, our medical terminologies for the condition depends on what occupies the pleural space. For instance, if it is air that is present there, we call it as pneumothorax, pneumothorax. Okay. For if there is fluid on the pleural space, we call it as pleural effusion. And when we deal about pleural effusion, it could be any of the three. It could be hydrothorax if there is presence of water. It might be hemothorax if there is presence of blood. And it could be pyothorax or empyema if there is presence of pus. Okay, pyothorax, Pyothorax. Again, Pyothorax. That's pyothorax or empyema. Empyema. Okay, so that is used if the fluid that occupies the pleural space is pus. So we could also observe on this slide that there are different types of um, closed chest drainage. It could be one bottle system. Obviously, there's only one bottle. It could be two bottle systems. So there are two bottles. And it could be three bottle systems. So obviously, there are three bottles for that. Okay. So let's start with the one bottle system. So for one bottle system, the bottle serves as a drainage or the collection bottle, and it also serves as the water seal bottle. Again, on one bottle system, the function is two. It becomes the collection bottle. At the same time, it is also served as water seal bottle. So for one bottle system, make sure that the tip of the tube is immersed in 2 to 3 centimeter of sterile normal saline solution so that it will create the water seal that we wanted. So make sure that the bottle is at least 2 to 3 feet below the level of the chest so that it will allow the drainage from the pleura using the gravity, and never raise the bottle above the level of the chest so that it will prevent the reflux of air or fluid going back to the pleural cavity. Okay, so we also need to assess the patency of our device. So in doing so, we need to observe the fluctuation of fluid along the tube. So there is a fluid on the tube, so we need to look at the rise and fall of the fluid on the tube. Okay, every time the patient makes inhalation and exhalation. So another thing is that we need to observe an intermittent bubbling on the water seal. Okay? It should be intermittent, because if that is a continuous bubbling, it means that there is air leakage. It is not tightly sealed. The bottle system is not tightly sealed. What we only need is to have intermittent bubbling. So meaning to say, every exhalation, that is the time that there needs to have a bubble on it. Okay? So, what else? So again, just like what I have stated, as the patient inhales, the fluid along the tube goes up, and when they exhale, the fluid on the tube goes down. And as it goes down, bubble appears. Okay, so that's the normal thing that we need to see for the one bottle system. So in the absence of fluctuation, we can suspect that there could be an obstruction on the device. We need to check on the tubings. Maybe there are kink along the tubing. Aside from that, what we could do is to milk the tube towards the bottom. Again, in milking the tube, we need to milk the tube towards the bottle and not going back to the pleural space. However, if there's no obstruction, we might consider that the patient already um, reached the lung re-expansion. And for us to be able to take note that there is really lung re-expansion, it can only be validated by chest X-ray. Okay? So always remember that the air vent should be open to air. So basically, that is our one bottle system. On the other hand, we have the second bottle system. So for second bottle system, it can be connected or not connected to suction apparatus. Okay, if not connected to the suction apparatus, the first bottle is the drainage bottle, and the second bottle will act as the water seal. Okay, so what we need to do for the two bottle system is to observe for the fluctuation of the fluid along the tube. So which tube at the water seal bottle. So what we need also to look at is the intermittent bubbling with each respiration. Okay? So basically, it has the same concept of the one bottle system. The only difference is that we have a collection bottle or a drainage bottle, and we have a different water bottle for the water seal. Okay? So if ever it is connected to a suction apparatus, so the first bottle will serve as both the drainage and the water seal bottle, while the second bottle will act as the suction control bottle. So expect continuous bubbling in the suction control bottle if ever we have connected it to a suction apparatus. However, intermittent bubbling and fluctuation in the water seal is still needed to observe. But now, if it is connected on the suction suction apparatus or suction machine, we could only observe that on the first bottle. Okay, so make sure that the tip of the tube is immersed to 2 to 3 centimeter of sterile normal saline solution for us to stabilize the normal negative pressure in the lungs. Okay, so this protects the pleura from trauma if the suction pressure is inadvertently increased. Okay, so last, we have the three bottle system. So for the three bottle system, bottle one is the drainage bottle, bottle two is our water seal bottle, and our third bottle is the suction control bottle. So observe for intermittent bubbling and fluctuation with respiration in our water seal bottle. So again, on a three bottle system, which one is the water seal bottle? Yes, correct. That is our second bottle. Okay? So, however, there should be a continuous bubbling on the third bottle or the suction control bottle. Okay? Are we good with that? Are we clear? So, for nursing responsibilities, so if our patients are having a closed chest drainage. So we need to encourage them to do deep breathing and coughing exercises because these things will promote drainage. Okay, next, we could also turn the patient side to side on regular basis. We could also tell them to ambulate. They can walk around. Just make sure that the bottle is below their chest and it is still connected. Okay. Another thing, they could also do some range of motion exercises, especially of the arms near the insertion site. Okay. We could also mark the amount of drainage at regular intervals and record them. Um, we could we also need to avoid frequent milking or clamping of the tube to prevent tension pneumothorax. Okay? So removal of the chest tube, if ever it is needed to be removed, it should be done by the physician. Okay? So usually it is removed only when we already achieve the lung re-expansion or the fluid drainage already ceased. Okay, so there's no drain already. We were able to drain everything already. So chest X-ray is done to a certain lung expansion, and with that, the suction is discontinued and patient is placed on gravity drainage for 24 hours before the tube is totally removed. And during the removal of our um, closed chest drainage, we need to prepare for petroleum gauze, we need to prepare for suture removal kit. Okay, we need to prepare for sterile gloves, adhesive tape. Okay, so in doing so, in removing it, place client in semi-Fowler's position. We need to instruct the patient to exhale deeply and do the Valsalva maneuver as the chest tube is being removed. So assess for any complications like subcutaneous emphysema and respiratory distress. Okay? So and lastly, we need to perform physical examination, and for in performing the physical examination, we need to do the IPPA method. So we need to do the inspection, palpation, percussion, and auscultation. But actually, I know that you already know those things already from your health assessment classes. But just a sort of review. So for inspection, we need to check for any signs and symptoms of respiratory distress. We need to assess the inhalation and exhalation of our patients. We also need to check the speech pattern. Um, we also need to observe for any chest wall configuration, their chest movement, and we also need to look for the fingers and toes for its color and even the buccal membrane. So for palpation, we can palpate the trachea, we can palpate the chest wall, and assess the tactile fremitus. Okay? So if you will remember tactile fremitus, you need to put your palm on the chest wall and you're going to ask the patient to say for example, tres, 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 and you will be able to feel the vibration, and that's the tactile frequencies. So for percussion, we could percuss, and usually what we could have are resonance, hyperresonance, possible dull, especially if you are hitting the bones or the ribs, okay? And for auscultation, we are going to hear the different breath sounds, may it be normal or abnormal or adventitious breath sounds, okay? So some best practices that we can do during a physical assessment in doing the IPPA or the EPA, um, when auscultating the lung field, always use the diaphragm of our stethoscope. Breath sounds are considered high-pitched sounds, so diaphragm is much more accurate. So in auscultating the posterior chest, so we need to do the posterior first before we proceed to the anterior chest. Okay, so we also need to listen to the lung sound. And in listening, we start from top to bottom of the chest. So meaning to say we start always with the apices or the apex going to the base. Okay, so in auscultating, it is done also from side to side of the chest. Okay. And auscultate the anterior chest starting above the clavicle to listen to the apex of the lungs. So when auscultating the anterior chest, so once you are at the nipple line, move out alongside of the chest to the mid-axillary line. Okay, we could also place the diaphragm at the intercostal spaces. In doing so, in terms of voice, we could also assess the voice sound, okay? So voice sounds or the egophony, egophony, egophony. So usually, there is increased resonance of voice sounds that are heard when auscultating the lungs. So what we can do is ask the patient to say E, E, E. Okay, so normally, if that is normal, um, muffling, there is a muffling sound, and that's normal. Okay, so positive response for that, sound of E change to A, instead of E, E, E. When you are auscultating, when you are hearing them saying the E, what you can hear more is A, and that is because of the lung consolidation. Okay? So that is the egophony. So second, we have the whispered um, pectoriloquy. Okay? Pectoriloquy. How do we spell pectoriloquy? So that's Pectoriloquy. So for the whispered pectoriloquy, so it is the increased loudness, okay, of whispering noted during auscultation at the lung field on the patient's torso. So what we can do here is we can ask the patient to whisper, okay, and they will be whispering 1, 2, 3. So the sound should be faint and muffled. So if what we can hear, so again, that's normal if that is faint and muffled because it's whisper. However, if it is clear, again, it suggests that there is lung consolidation. Okay? So we also have bronchophony. Bronchophony, Bronchophony. Bronchophony. So that is the abnormal increase in amplitude and clarity of vocal sounds. So usually we can do is auscultate the posterior chest, ask them to state 99. Normal, it should be soft and muffled. But if it is loud and clear, so again, it means that the patient is experiencing lung consolidation. Maybe you are asking what lung consolidation is, right? So when we talk about lung consolidation, it occurs when the normal air-filled spaces of the lungs are filled by the products of the disease. So instead of having air on the lungs. So what we have there is the products of the disease. That makes the lung consolidated. Okay? So in terms of altered breathing patterns, so usual thing that we could hear or we could check are the chain stroke breathing, Kushmal breathing, hypoventilation, Biot's breathing, so apneustic breathing. So I know that those things were discussed already during your health assessment. Okay? And with that, I would like to thank you for listening and trying to understand this topic. Okay, so with that, thank you very much. Stay safe, everyone, and God bless. Thank you.